Thanks for joining me again for another episode of On My Family Tree. This episode is called Fruit because from the tree our parents created came two pieces of fruit, my sister Sandra and me. As I've stated before, I know that I've left out someone or something. Again, I apologize in advance. Let's begin in 1952. After their marriage, my parents, Howard and Barbara Wright, lived in two homes in Pasadena, 901 North Garfield and 1779 El Sereno Avenue. Fulfilling his aspiration as a high school senior, my father got a job with the U.S. Post Office as a letter carrier, also in Pasadena. To supplement his income, he got odd jobs, painting, gardening, and working with his father, my grandfather Wright, in his interior decorating business. My mother taught piano out of our home and later became an elementary school teacher in the Pasadena Unified School District. In the spring of 1954, my mother gave birth to her first child, a girl. My parents named her Sandra Allison Wright. She was born at St. Luke's Hospital in Pasadena. When she was young, Sandra was a campfire girl. She also liked ballet. In her own words, she told me that she was an avid reader and spent many days of summer vacation at the local library. I arrived 6 years later in 1960, also at St. Luke's. We lived at 1779 El Sereno until August of 1963. Then my parents bought a home in nearby Altadena at 540 Cocopan Drive. Approximately a year and a half after I was born, in the summer of 1961, both my grandfather on my father's side, James Andrew Wright, and my great-grandfather on my mother's side, John Henry Bowman, died on opposite sides of the country within 6 weeks of each other. My sister and I had a pretty normal life growing up. Our parents stressed good manners, doing well in school, and the importance of hard work. We had our challenges, like all families, but we grew up in a safe neighborhood, went on summer vacations, and attended church most Sundays. For as long as I can remember, Sandra and I spent most weekends at the home of our maternal grandparents, Grant and Edmonia Bowman, who resided in Pasadena. Initially, they lived at 600 West Claremont, and in 1955, they bought a two-story home at 665 Palisade Street, a few blocks away. I remember that occasionally some members of my grandfather's family would visit from Virginia during the 1960s and 70s, including his sister, my Aunt Vera, her husband, Uncle Lester, and their daughter Sylvia, along with her husband, John Allen. Also, my grandfather's nephews, Nathaniel, Bowman, and Wes Coleman, along with Wes's wife, Barbara. Sandra and I attended Loma Alta Elementary School, Elliott Junior High School, and John Muir High School. I also went to Grover Cleveland Elementary School for 1 year, where my mother also taught. In 1971, Sandra tried out for Pasadena's Tournament of Roses court, making it all the way to the semifinalist round of 70 out of 625 initial contestants. My grandmother, Edmonia Hughes Bowman, remained employed as a housekeeper during this time. She seemed to enjoy this period of her life. Fiercely independent, still in great health, married for 5 decades, along with being a mother and grandmother to my mom, Sandra, and me. She kept in touch with her late mother's sisters, Aunt Rosa and Aunt Margaret, by phone and by letters. As best as I could tell, they were the only people in her family she wished to be in contact with. It didn't matter to me, but I noticed it. Once in a while, she would speak of her grandfather, Dennis Evans, who, along with his wife, Melinda, helped raise my grandmother after her mother, Melissa Evans Hughes, died in 1911. Sandra initially attended Pasadena Nazarene College, later known as Point Loma. Then she transferred to Occidental College in Eagle Rock, my mother's alma mater. While she was at Occidental College in the mid-70s, Sandra met her future husband, Mark Stephen Benjamin Roberts, at a party. Benji, as he preferred to be called, was born in Riverside, California, on March 21, 1947. They were married in 1975. Toward the end of the 1970s, my grandfather, Joseph Grant Bowman, began suffering from heart problems. He was in and out of Huntington Memorial Hospital. He died on July 31, 1981. He was 75. Sandra and Benji lived in Riverside for over 20 years, having 3 sons before divorcing in 1997. Their first son was Christopher, born in May of 1979, Morgan in January of 1981, and Grant in February of 1983. While I was in high school in the late 1970s, I was on the honor roll for 2 years, ran on the track and field team, and was editor of the high school newspaper in my senior year. My grandmother, as I mentioned, always an independent woman, did an admirable job going on after my grandfather's death in '81. However, after she became unable to handle her own affairs, she moved to Riverside to be closer to Sandra and Benji's family in 1984. 2 weeks after her 77th birthday, in May of 1985, my grandmother took her life. She was buried with my grandfather at Mountain View Cemetery in Pasadena. After my grandmother's death, I came across a few letters she had received from her father, John Thomas Hughes. He had separated from her mother when my grandmother was only 4 years old. Based upon what he wrote in his letters, my grandmother and her father had apparently maintained a good relationship until his passing in August of 1953. For 5.5 years, I attended and later graduated from Cal State Los Angeles in 1984. During that period, I also attended UCLA for summer school, I pledged a fraternity, and worked at Magic Mountain in Valencia. It was also at Magic Mountain when, at the age of 23, I was in my first film feature, made by fellow employees. On April 9th, 1984, my father's 60th birthday, I hired into Allstate Insurance Company. 6 months later, Sandra got a job at California Steel in Fontana. 3 years later, in 1987, I bought my first camcorder and began making my own videos for pleasure, and for work. Meanwhile, Sandra and Benji's boys were growing up out in Riverside, occasionally coming to visit me at my home and their grandparents. My mother retired from teaching in 1982. My father from the post office in 1987. In June of 1990, I met Karen Rivers on a singles retreat sponsored by West Angeles Church in LA. That's it for Fruit, 1952 to 1990. Stay tuned for more Fruit, 1990 to 2010. Coming up next.